Welcome to another episode of Inspire People, Impact Lives, and I'm your host, Josh Kosnick. And by trade, I'm a financial advisor, and by training, a leader and now managing partner at Northwestern Mutual. So last week, I hope you enjoyed Beth Prohaska's episode on designing workplace culture and designing effective teams. Today, I'm really excited to discuss how diversity and inclusion plays a huge role in creating a competitive workforce. And joining me on the show today, I have a special guest in Dr. Jerlando Jackson. And he is a globally recognized organizational scientist, leadership strategist, entrepreneur, and university professor here at UW-Madison. An award-winning book author, and Dr. Jackson has delivered hundreds of research papers and keynote addresses across 15 countries now. His seminal research is focused on organizational science with a special interest in hiring practices, career mobility, workforce diversity, and workforce discrimination. He's recognized as the chief architect of the study of organizational disparities, which is an emerging subfield of organizational studies. As a pioneering education influencer, he holds rights to numerous intellectual properties, has published and lectured extensively on strategies to disrupt organizational disparities across multiple employment industries. Dr. Jackson is regularly cited in stories that appear in, I can't even pronounce that, Hetchinger Report? Is that right? Did I do that right?
Yes, you did.
All right. The Chronicle of Higher Education, diverse issues in higher education, Education Dive, and local newspapers like his previous residence, the Houston Chronicle. He served as a board member or advisor to various organizations that include universities, nonprofits, startups, and established companies. In addition, he regularly provides confidential advice to executives and key decision makers faced with solving complex organizational challenges and career choices. So building on his vision of intellectual property asset stewardship, he serves on the leadership teams of JCF LLC, Bridge to Community LLC, EQU Holdings LLC, and Life Quandary LLC. So a really impressive resume. I'm really thankful for Martinez White hooking us up today and having this conversation. And I want to have our guests get to know a little bit about your background before we jump into the hot topic today. So can you give us a little glimpse of the backdrop that led you to where you are today?
Sure. My journey started in Georgia, where I grew up my primary years of education on a military base. And that structure has certainly led me to provide a certain type of lens into the world for me. Began my life as a musician, and my undergraduate degrees in music, with the initial career trajectory to be playing in the Boston Philharmonic. And while touring the country doing drum and bugle corps, I was introduced to the field of post-secondary education. Like many of us who have gone to college, we've spent very little time trying to understand how those that were working with us ended up there.
Yeah.
And that serendipitous conversation where one of the instructors talked about going back to get their graduate degree was life-changing for me. After hearing the discussion, it was certainly, in many ways, a true match. And luckily, I was able to return back from tour, meet with my academic advisor. I was going into my final year of college, undergraduate that is, and learned two very interesting things. The first one was that we had the major at my undergraduate institution, but also that I had a high enough GPA to be concurrently enrolled and admitted as a graduate student and an undergraduate. And so my final year, I was concurrently working toward a degree in post-secondary education, and that was the beginning for me. And so that journey has ultimately brought me here to the great state University of Wisconsin, where I've been going on 19 years. And I've been so fortunate to be in a place where my intellectual curiosity related to organizations and organization decision-making, growth, and what occurs in these organizations to ultimately land at a place where my emphasis really unpacks organizational disparities. What is occurring in organizations that may be disruptive to career opportunities for individuals based on characteristics and backgrounds.
Well, that's fascinating. So been in Madison now 19 years.
August 1 is 19.
Okay, well, just about there,
Mm-hmm.
just about a month away. So we're awfully blessed to have you. So can you tell us about your mantra that drives your work with your organizations?
Sure. I often say that organizations are made up of people, and it's the people and the decisions that they make that we need to address. Oftentimes we find ourselves in conversations where we humanize organizations and we talk about, for example, the University of Wisconsin. And we do it in such a way as if the institution's making decisions, but in fact, it's really the people,
It's
right?
the people in there,
people
yeah.
are making the decisions, and we have to be very strategic about shaping the vision, providing the type of background and information for key decision makers to understand the values that they can impose as they lead these institutions. And so really the type of work that I do while we talk about organizations, our emphasis is very much so on the people that lead them and make decisions on their behalf.
That's really good. So you've been in this field almost your whole career, is that what we say?
Yes.
Beyond your secondary education?
Absolutely. The focus on organizations, primarily educational organizations, have certainly been at the forefront of my graduate preparation.
So what do you think, and what have you seen broad that is significantly different from when you started to today, whether it be in the field in general or in organizations?
You know, I would say organizations have become more sophisticated as it relates to understanding the experiences of those that are working and living in those spaces. I mean, we have introduced organizational concepts such as living and learning spaces, which is not as new today as it was maybe 20, 25 years ago, but it certainly opened the door for us to start thinking about these are places that more than work was occurring, but actually learning was occurring, growing was occurring.
Mm-hmm.
And as we begin to think about these organizations as more than work, it also causes us to think about the experiences, whether the experiences are the same for all groups or whether these experiences are different for certain groups. And if they are different, why? And do those differences create career opportunities that may segment those opportunities by certain groups in such a way that you might see and experience segregation by opportunity and rank. And so over the last, I would say 30 years, we've certainly become more attentive to how workers are experiencing these organizations and spaces.
So kind of off that, and sorry I didn't prep you for this, that's how my
Sure.
ADD mind works, is do you think that organizations have gotten better or more aware or both, or possibly even worse in your last 20, 30 years?
It's mixed, right? I think it's mixed because it's certainly top of mind that to remain competitive, you do need to be very conscientious of the morale. You do need to be very conscientious of the kind of reward structure and the vision, right? And so you have leaders who have taken this up in such an authentic way that they have truly changed their organizations where there may be work-life balance in play, that women don't have to choose as much as maybe in the past. But there certainly will always be individuals who have learned how to game the system, right? That the language is there, the rhetoric is there, and the protective mechanisms are there, but the actualized outcomes are no different than they were before. So I think we would have to land on a place to say that it's mixed in the sense that the authentic drive will play an important role in really how that organization is ultimately experienced by all who may get to engage.
I have a ton of spin-off questions, but I want to give some framework before we get into
Oh,
that.
let's go with it.
So let's provide the framework for those. So we talked, briefly before the show. I've received in the last 5 years a lot of training, which I'm evolving in my diversity and inclusion work as a human being and in my operation. But for those that haven't had the training or just hear these buzzwords of diversity and inclusion either in their organization or on the news, could you provide the listeners with a framework for them to understand how you define diversity and inclusion?
Sure. And we can keep this very simple and operational. So diversity includes the full spectrum of demographic diversity that we will see in this world, which would include race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, ableism, age, across the gamut, right? That when we talk about diversity, it's not exclusively race, ethnicity, right? It is the diversity that you bring because your lived experiences will allow you to provide a voice at the table that is shaped exclusively by what comes with you and how you got to be there. From an inclusion standpoint, which to be distinctly different is how inclusive and engaged that diversity gets to be when it's all inside of an organization, right? Like how inclusive and how included do individuals feel, and whether that inclusion penetrates the mission, penetrates the reward structure, and penetrates opportunities. Mm-hmm. Where magic happens is when you have diversity and inclusion. And where you have diversity and inclusion, there's strategy, ideally. Strategy that is linked very much to strategic objectives, very much to hiring objectives, very much to a vision that fully recognizes that in a diverse world such as this, you have to have diverse thinkers to put the product that you would need to reach all these diverse places and individuals. You can't do it without the type of diversity at the table. Mm-hmm. And so that's where the magic happens. And that's where the opportunity is for organizations, but that's also where the downfall happened for some organizations, where there's voices missing at the table. And we've got media examples of major corporations having a PR snafu. They put millions of dollars into an ad and no one ever told them that is inappropriate, right? Yeah, so those are good examples of why if you don't have diversity at the table, you're likely to lose in the long term.
Yeah, I just think about being proactive versus reactive when you talked about those commercials. Mm-hmm. You think about how, like you said, millions of dollars that go into creating that ad, and then all of a sudden there's a Twitter or public uproar because you, like you said, didn't have someone at the table or go, you know what, maybe that's not such a good idea.
Right.
Five
minutes.
Ignorant.
5 minutes of discussion.
Yeah.
And it's fixed.
And they're like, where it could have been like, thank you for pointing that out. That could have saved us millions of dollars.
Right.
So that's great. So I think we're getting into this with kind of leading to, but why do you think diversity and inclusion is so essential and for a competitive U.S. workforce?
We, as a country, have come to a point where there's a shift. And historically, we've had a strong economy that could largely be managed by the talent workforce of white males. And we're at a point in our time in our nation where white males are going to college at a much smaller rate than historically, which also means that we have fewer white males going on to obtain those graduate degrees, undergraduate degrees, to supply a highly skilled workforce. When you remove the largest portion of our historical workforce, that leads you to look at the next category that has often filled some of the gaps, and that's foreign-born talent. And we've relied on foreign-born talent to come, get educated in our post-secondary systems, find great value in staying here, staying and allowing us to supplement our highly skilled workforce. We are at a point where their home countries have very competitive economies, whereby in some ways they're outperforming the United States. So those foreign-born talents are going back home. The same is true is, unfortunately, we have some foreign policies that are disruptive to opportunities to recruit, retain, or keep foreign-born talent that could be in our workforce. So that leaves us with a couple of options, and that is looking closely at groups that have been excluded from this workforce. And, we have historical evidence to suggest that women and people of color have had to spend a good bit of time, energy, and legal battles to have the opportunity to work.
Yeah.
But not only work, but have equal access to opportunities in our various organizations that still today is long-standing battle on whether these access and opportunities are equitable. We're now at a time where we really have to get past that, right? We have to get past the reality. There's no other places for us to turn than our women and people of color populations that are here, ready, available, and at this point, equally or educated at a much higher level if we look at the participation rates in college and postgraduate.
So it's interesting as you were saying that, as I knew that there was more women graduating than ever and more than men, maybe even white men, maybe that was the statistic. I didn't know that there was fewer and fewer white men going into college. Is that a drop or because there's more and more biracial and more ethnicities getting blended, where not as many people be identifying as just a straight white male? Does that play a part of it, or is there literally a shift in white men choosing not to go to college?
Now, so I won't get into why, because that we'll need a whole nother session on why. But when we think about it, and we can just think, and locally we could think in the state, and when they talk about our student enrollment being largely women, well, if you break it down, if less than 5% of the population is of color to start with, it's not being driven by any of the populations of color, right? That's being driven by the non-diverse population, right? So if it's 70% female students, that's overwhelmingly 70% white female students, right? Yeah. So I don't think there's any way of getting around the change in the role that white males are playing in school, in college, and in the workforce. Those numbers are dwindling, and there does not appear to be a trend to suggest it's going to go back the other way at this particular point in time.
Yeah. So in summation, companies have to be good at being attractive to all, and not only being attractive, but being able to retain all.
That's right.
Right. So that's really interesting. So do you have thoughts? So I know you do, because this is your life's work. Why we continue to struggle with diversity in the workplace?
Sure. It is a baffling question, and it's baffling because all of the evidence suggests that homogeneous organizations are going to continue to struggle, right? That when you are going through the hiring process and the recruitment process, and you receive more applications that tend to come from diverse backgrounds, that there's a ton of evidence out there that suggests that the landscape of the workforce is changing, right? and that there's no question we have to think differently about what our ideal worker looks like, how that work plays into our workforce. But it also is just another reflection as a country that we're still paralyzed when it comes to dealing with race and gender.
Mm-hmm.
Like, race and gender are such big topics in the United States of America that many of our grand challenges are attached to those two items.
I know this is a very short but big question. Why? It seems so simple, like, and I've been open. I'm a Christian. I believe in God. Like, we're created equal. Whether your skin color is the color of yours or mine, whether you have your two beautiful daughters here today with us, being good and quiet over there while we're recording. I got 3 beautiful little girls at home and 1 little boy. But why? It seems so simple, but why do we make it so hard?
Let me talk a little bit about social closure theory. Social closure theory is a good way where I can try to make sense of this. So social closure theory argues that groups tend to act on the behalf of themselves almost primarily because they want to be together. Not with any intent or malice as it relates to individuals not in their group, but exclusively because they want to be together. So, for example, we can create a group right here today. It appears that everyone in this particular room likes their lapels with top stitch. Okay? So, if that's the case, we could create a group. And that group means that we, with our peak lapels, he has a notch, so he just got booted out the group, want to sit together in the boardroom. Let's go away from boardroom because we're dealing with exclusivity there. But let's just say in the auditorium.
Okay.
And we've decided we're going to sit in the front of the room just because we want to and we want to be together. And if necessary, we'll send someone ahead to secure the seats for us. We're going to be very planful, mindful, and strategic. And we're going to sit together. But we're not going to spend any time thinking about who else wants to sit there. We didn't think about them when we decided we wanted to sit there. We didn't put any consideration into who might benefit the most in participating in the auditorium and sitting there. We're not thinking about anyone that has any visual impairments, any hearing impairments, or any other type of differences that suggest we probably should let them sit there.
Mm-hmm.
And in turn, we create an environment that's going to look very different from the outside. We're excluding everybody else. We've just completely ignored individuals who should have the ability to sit in the front, right? And so in our organizations, for those that have thought about what it means for behavior to go unstructured, we have these outcomes. But if we have an organization that takes ownership and not only allow individuals to kind of operate however they see fit, that organizational ownership thinks carefully about how these disparities create. Therefore, in most cases, we all can't sit in the front row because probably half of the seats have been set aside for someone that has some type of impairment. Mm-hmm. Because the building or the organization has thought through it. We need to be mindful that there are a lot of reasons why certain access and opportunities should be in place, right? So social closure theory actually shifts the ownership of the disparities and challenges that we see in organizations back to the organization, and says that it's the organizations, therefore their leaders, who have thought carefully about the conditions that they are creating in such a way that the lived experiences are differentiated, right? And so we don't have to want to do anything other than sit next to each other because we want to compare notes, right, on our blazers or something else, and to decide if we let him back in with him wearing that notch lapel. Otherwise, the organization helps to kind of do this adjudication that's necessary in organizations. And that's just a microcosm of the kind of realities of full industries,
it's a really
countries,
good example.
and cities. Yes.
Really good visual example. I could picture that auditorium as you were going through it. That's interesting. But so we're shifting back to the organizations, and the organizations can have a huge impact. But aren't you also just saying there that we as human beings are selfish and not thinking about others outside of ourselves or outside of that group?
I think that could be an interpretation, right? But, many of us are so consumed with our daily realities, we're only thinking about what we need to do to get through the day, right? Yeah. One could interpret that as selfish, or one could certainly just realize that we live in an environment where you're more likely to be focused on what you need to do and accomplish in that day than to be so as conscientious as you could be. So I wouldn't want to paint it with a broad stroke, right? Because I do think that there are some unintended actions that, certainly come across in ways in which where it might appear that the person is not being mindful. But I just think we live in a very busy time, and we live in a time where some of the barriers between understanding differences should be not as severe. But it also means that we are still also highly likely to create spaces where we're most likely only dealing with individuals that want the peak lapel, not the notch lapel, which is, there's some appropriateness to it. So I don't want to be exclusionary to you, okay?
I think your notch lapel looks good, Chad. I own some notch lapels as well, so we're all good. And for those of you that don't know peak or notch, because you don't have to wear a suit, just Google search that. They got images. So I know you've talked a lot about this already, but maybe give us some percentages. Is there a business case for diversity and inclusion? So why would corporate pass down an initiative such as diversity and inclusion as a primary focus for an organization? Sure.
On the onset of answering this question, I think it's important to note that when organizations and leaders are asking the question now of the business case, that they're behind, right? Yeah. Right. There's tons of information and data out there that does support the notion that you want diverse thinkers at the table. Yeah. For example, from Forbes, just a few things of relevance. 67% of candidates would want to join a diverse team. 57% of employees prioritize diversity. Okay. You also have 70% of these diverse organizations are more likely to capture new markets. Okay. So these are just examples that the more diversity you have at the table, the more likely you are to have innovative products that meet the diverse populations we have, but also connecting the dots to an earlier point, you're less likely to make certain insensitivity mistakes purely because you don't have a single person on the team to recognize that ad shouldn't go out that way, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's great value in thinking about a business case for diversity and inclusion.
And the stat you didn't read on inclusive companies enjoy 2.3 times higher cash flow.
Yes.
So there's like just in and of itself there, beyond the other stats you read, that is pretty impressive.
And I'm glad you picked that. You're the right person to pick that cash flow one out.
We deal with money. So yeah. So I mean, and I think you're right. If they don't know some of this stuff already, like I mean, the empirical evidence on this is pretty glaring. So I think more for the listeners, I know that there's sometimes I'm asked within my organization, I was like, is this just a corporate thing they're pushing us to do? Is it, is it going to make a difference? Stuff of that nature. Like, so yes, there's multiple levels where this makes a difference. If you're just money focused, we just read some stats where that works. If you're just conscientious, like wanting to be a good person, want to have a good, diverse team, then there's stats that help that on, as you said, with candidates wanting to join a diverse team, see diversity, making sure that everyone feels welcome in that organization. Much, I can't say much more about that. That's incredible. So
I ought to say too, it's also used as a filibuster technique, right? With most actions, if we want to stall, we'll start asking for data, evidence, benchmarking, and a whole host of things before we make action. And so sometimes, those types of discussions are meant to sort of filibuster on action. I think there's enough information out there that action is what we all need in our organizations, that will also lead to personal development, and so that we can play our roles and have some level of sensitivity to realize maybe we should sit in the second row because there's some other people who might benefit from sitting in the first row.
And I just, on a personal note, I've learned so much from diverse people within my organization that have helped me become the man I am today, the leader I am today. And I know I wouldn't be either of those people, and I'm still a work in progress, and I don't ever think I'm going to arrive, quote unquote. But what I have really learned and taken away from them has been invaluable and just eye-opening. I mean, just to step outside of your own comfort zone. Stephen Covey, one of his 7 leadership habits of highly effective people, seek first to understand, then to be understood. I think that is how you can approach diversity and understanding knowing what you don't know, and then trying to continue to be a better person and make it a better and better place from there. So what steps stemming from, okay, now we got that it's good for business, it's good for morale, it's good for culture. What steps can organizations take to address workplace disparities? Sure.
It should be no surprise as a researcher, I argue before any action be taken, you capture where you are as an organization. So you want to do an assessment of your organizational culture and readiness for this shift, because you are going to adjust the culture of your organization, which is going to, in some ways, begin to make adjustments to the value structure and system. The second is that leaders will have to model the desired behavior. If it does not consistently come from the top as a new direction, a priority direction, the organization is not going to stand a chance. The leaders have to equally value being diverse and inclusive as any other organizational priority. Then the third would be education and training is going to be necessary. I mean, this is not a journey you want to begin on alone. You want to have expert guidance, support from top to bottom. The leaders are going to need to be able to talk through some of these decisions, talk through pushback, but at the very same time, middle managers and early career professionals will need some guidance to understand what's accepted now in the workplace and the level of conscientiousness. And then consistent messaging of expectations and desired outcomes. If it's not consistent, it'll be mixed. And you want to have consistent messaging of these priorities and the outcomes. And what that means sometimes is being very clear at points of challenge what's not acceptable. And while adjudicating individuals' behavior is a very difficult thing to do. When inappropriate behavior occurs, that's where the leader has an opportunity to demonstrate this is not acceptable, does not belong, and we will not tolerate that in our organization. So that level of consistency is going to be very important. So those four on a macro level steps will get an organization certainly moving in the right direction.
Oh, that's really good. So to surmise there what he's just said, assessment of the organizational culture and readiness, leaders must model the desired behavior. And this is nothing new to a leader, right? Lead by example, is what you're saying there. And education and training for those in the organization, and consistent messaging of expectations and desired outcomes. So all of those really, really good. Is there a litmus test when you're looking at organizations to gauge their commitment to diversity and inclusion?
Sure. My personal litmus test is, I wouldn't say this is universal, but who the organization selects as leaders, including those they put on the board, signals very important things about that organization and its value structure. And it says who they trust and who they believe can lead with integrity, authenticity, and things of that nature. When you look at the board and you look at the leaders and you do not see certain groups, it sends the message that those groups are not valued contributors. Many organizations, even those that are well-meaning, have certainly sent the message that these groups are good enough to be a part of the organization, but not good enough or valued enough to lead these organizations. And so as we move beyond toward 2020, organizations that lack diversity in the senior level roles and on their boards are certainly sending a very strong message.
Is there a litmus test as far as critical mass, where I've heard a statistic, and maybe you know it better than I, is if there's not a certain percentage of that grouping in a room, that they often won't speak up? Let's say if there's just one person of color or one female in the room. Is there a critical mass? Can you speak to that at all?
I think that there has been research done on the role of critical mass, not only in groups from a leadership standpoint, but also what's the critical mass for recruiting students and things of that nature. It's a bit murky. I would maybe turn our attention to the environment and culture. It could be one person in the room, but if that one person feels supported and valued, they would be more likely to speak up because they understand that their voice is there and is a significant contributor. When they don't speak up, there's a question mark, and the question becomes, am I in a position to be disruptive? Should I? Will I have support? Is my position now at stake? And so I think beyond the critical mass piece, recognizing that a mission of diversity and inclusion will certainly move beyond an organization that will likely be diverse from top to bottom. But even in that context, we're beginning, I think we focusing much more on the level of comfort that individuals and leaders have when they're at the table to speak or not speak. And so I think that kicks in even if you look like everybody in the room or not.
Yeah, I would agree with you. So you're saying that the biggest thing is making sure that whether it's one person or 10 people, that they're only going to speak up if they feel the leader is empowering them to and that they got their back.
Yeah, and the rest of the people in the room really wants to hear what they have to say. Because if the person speaks up and every time their perspective is completely glossed over, never taken into consideration, eventually the message is what you bring to the table is not valued in such a way that we will change course because of what you have to say. So, again, I think that plays out even if you look like everybody in the room. There's people in that room that don't feel like their voice is as powerful as others in the room.
And that's just great leadership principle or tactic, however you want to take it in general. It doesn't matter if it's about diversity or not. Everyone in that room should feel empowered. Mm-hmm. So that's really good. So taking a little dive to a different direction, maybe not, but you wrote a great article for credit unions. It was titled 6 Reasons Why Credit Unions Are Uniquely Positioned to Carry Out Diversity and Inclusion Objectives. So how or why did you see either credit unions or the financial industry as a whole as a good fit? So why'd you go about that article in that way?
Well, I'll say I was invited to think about the positionality of credit unions in the financial industry as well as across organizations, and I was struck as I was working on it that just credit unions, their how and why they were founded, and their mission provides in the very onset what most organizations have to re-engineer, right? Like their mission was and is to help the less fortunate. Their history is to be at the table for those that were excluded from the ability to bank, whether it was by gender, race, or whatever it was, whatever your case may be. And so where some organizations would have to engineer a strategic plan that says we value these things, or build a new future that can bring in some of these diversity principles and commitments, they from day one can go back and reconnect to their charter, history, objectives, and missions and say, we are here to stand in partnership with disenfranchised groups. We don't think of you as a customer. We think of you as a member, right? It just was very intriguing to me that they have the ingredients to certainly, be a very inclusive, welcoming set of organizations.
That's really cool. And we're a mutual company that's been benefit for our policy owners. So when I was in personal practice and I was trying to explain the structure of Northwestern Mutual to a potential client or someone that just didn't know the industry, I was saying, here's the difference with us. We're in business for our policy owners. Stock companies in business for their stockholders. Here's what that might mean to you. So, and sometimes I would use credit unions as an example because people sometimes understand the difference between credit unions and banks a little bit better than the structure of insurance or financial institutions as a whole. So that's good. You've also done a lot of research with athletes and their development journey through college and then on to their career. What would you say our athletes need help with the most for job placement after sports?
It certainly is it depends question, right? Because the experiences for students.
Well, you can't answer it depends.
yeah. It depends because the experience of student athletes is so varied that I don't want to send the wrong message that it's uniform, right? That depending on Division I, Division II, that the resources, the structure of the day, and what's available for student support services, career development, and things of that nature varies. But I think it is fair to say that most student athletes have certainly been put in a position where they have had to balance a commitment between being a student and an athlete. And we have put these young men and women in a system that says you have to choose, that you have to choose to be one or the other. And in doing that, it means that if you are maybe a star athlete in high school, there's certain classes that you have now automatically been pushed out of because when they're offered, how they're offered. So as a country, we haven't done a good job to where we've eliminated the competing interests and made them dual interests.
Mm-hmm.
So where I'm going with this is that in most cases, student athletes either have to articulate on their own a network, an interest in their careers, and provide those supports. And in some cases, the institutions have been very thoughtful in their ability to do that for them. And so the types of experiences that many students in a college university would have to be able to do internships, exposure, interaction becomes very challenging because of the practice schedule, because of potential NCAA violations, and on down the list, right? So there are some structural realities that we have put into place to make it difficult or more challenging for student athletes to fully explore their career interest.
Yeah, I totally resonate with you there as a former student athlete myself, but not at the Division I level, but we have Division I level athletes that are in our internship right now, and I'm just thinking about what you just said there because of practice schedules is our football players really only have 2 months with us, whereas the rest of the students will have a full summer to gain this internship and the knowledge that we put into them and pour into them over the course of the 3.5 months. Football players really only have 2 months before their practice schedules kick off. And even so, they have lifting schedules that they have to adhere to, that they may have to skip some stuff that we have going on as well. So there is those limitations. But on the flip side, I want to say to all you student athletes out there or anyone that might listen to this is you are highly coveted. As we talked about before, the responsibility that you show in being able to balance a full class load and your sport, that shows a level of maturity and responsibility to us employers that a traditional student may not have. So although they may have some honor society on their resume or some club that may be highly sought after for a corporate job, on my side of things, what I'm looking for is someone that has that responsibility, that drive, that can balance a lot and be and want that autonomy to be whatever they want to be. So I just want to put that out there. As you were talking about the challenges, like for me, I highly covet student athletes because of those characteristics as well, regardless if they got an internship before or not. But that was resonating for me as you were saying that because I was thinking about our current interns. So are there programs employers can get involved with to help athletes after sports or, kind of while they're in school? Or does that vary by college or?
The familiarity I have is certainly varied by college, largely driven by how the academic support structure is set up at the institution. For example, at the University of Wisconsin, there's a very robust unit that carries this work out, where they have thought through carefully how to make those connections. But then again, you have some smaller programs where that's very much so a challenge. So it is a case-by-case basis. Okay. And there are some movements out there to make that work a bit more accessible. I personally have been a part of the development of a program which has spun off into a outside university entity, like a startup that has an explicit intent to be a supportive co-partner with universities to allow student athletes to have a laser-like focus on their post-playing career opportunities. And so we're really at a ideation stage right now on what that's going to look like going forward. But it's certainly an area that I'm personally committed to, because I've been able to see firsthand that oftentimes we're having discussions about student athletes not completing, and rarely are we talking about student athletes that do complete but have particular degrees that didn't necessarily align with their career interests, and have been provided very little guidance on how you connect the dots. And so that certainly is a area of interest that I personally have.
Yeah, no, that's a phenomenal point. And then a lot of times it's just that education that some companies may care about that degree and, being in that field, and some don't. Like, for instance, I have a lot of people whose perception to come into a financial organization like mine that you need a personal finance or finance degree, or at least a business degree, which I have a gentleman that's been in my office for long before I was here. He's been 35 plus years, who was an English major. And now he's a financial advisor, a very, very good financial advisor, has been since the 1980s. And we have poli-sci majors here, and myself, who didn't graduate college. So, but the perception is that you need a personal finance degree, whereas this is a career where it's very nurturing and there's a lot of education that goes into it. So it really is about personality over degree and whether or not this is a right fit. So an organization like you're talking about that can educate them on that these type of corporations, these type of careers look for that degree being in alignment. These don't. And where does your personality best fit to kind of push them in the right direction so that they feel they have those opportunities that other students might have. So that's really good. So any other thoughts on the athlete side of things? I'm always intrigued by that, being a former athlete myself, but I didn't want to shortchange anything there.
I think it's certainly, as I mentioned before, putting these young men and women in a position where these two interests are in conflict with one another is not desirable. We do have to create more opportunities where these can be concurrent and mutually supportive interest.
Good. That's really good. Oh, I remember the question I was going to ask you. Are there any industries doing a really good job with this work in particular, or is there just specific companies that you know of that are doing a really good job?
Being supportive of
with
former
diversity,
student athletes.
With student athletes, or even broadly on the diversity and inclusion side, like we were talking about earlier.
I'm a bit hesitant to hold up any organization as an example, but I will say that there's a significant amount of energy being placed in tech firms in Silicon Valley because of some of the stark realities associated with what it means to be able to be at the table in the technology industry. It's fast-paced, high-priced, and you have to come, in many ways, you have to come to the table with an infrastructure behind you to be very competitive. So we are now seeing some movement where there's some diversity on the boards out there, some diversity among the leadership, but also we're also beginning to see that there are some female-led and persons of color-led tech firms receiving some of the startup resources to be at the table as well. So I think I would say maybe in general we're making important small steps across the board, and at some point in the near future, I hope we find a way to make some accelerations in these spaces, because I think that our global competitiveness is certainly dependent upon us as a country to get over our holdups around gender and race ethnicity.
All right, next question is a big question, because this is your life's work. So whenever you choose to retire or whenever you pass on, what do you hope to have accomplished? What does your legacy look like with this life's work? What do you hope the world looks like? And what do you want you, Dr. Jerlando Jackson's legacy to be with this work?
I would love it if organizational disparities is a full-fledged body of study where hiring practices, challenges associated with the review of reference letters, cover letters, and all the way to glass ceiling effects, and a whole host of challenges we know to be occurring within organizations, was a full body of work that can fuel practice, right? That the impact would be if we can put in the hands of leaders and practitioners good information that suggests that not purely because it's the right thing to do, but also arm them with the information to compel everyone in their organization to see great values into minimizing and disrupting the barriers that prevent everyone to equally contribute and participate. If that happens, I'll be a very lucky person, simply because most of the people that live their lives in the academy are conducting research and presenting to approximately 40 to 50 people once a year at their academic research conference. And I would say for me, I certainly find great value in that, but I've made a commitment that if this work is to make a difference, I have to develop partnerships. I have to create opportunities to interface with organizations, communities, and leaders in such a way that there's a bridge between what's going on in the academy or the ivory towers and working hand in hand with the individuals that need the information that we're working on the most. If that happens, I can ride off into the sunset, start wearing notch lapels, and call it a day.
That's good. So my dad always taught me that as a leader, it's your job to work yourself out of a job. Yeah. Do you ever aspire to that? Do you hope someday that your work, collective work with all the other people that work hard like you do to provide the research and tools for us in the corporate world, in the organization, not just corporate, but organizational world, do you hope to work yourself out of a job, that this isn't an issue going forward at some point?
That would be a fascinating story if that occurred in my lifetime. And I certainly am agreeable with the advice that you were provided. I would love it if that was the case. And quite frankly, our country deserves that. The people in our country deserves that, that where they can have dreams and those dreams can be realized in all these spaces that we're talking about.
That's good. Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I know it might be a pipe dream, and especially with all the information, good and bad, that you have, that you've researched over the time, that might be fool's gold, but it's surely a great goal to aspire to, I would think. So last couple questions as we're wrapping up, as I forewarned you, hopefully, that favorite book of all time or most recent book that you read that you'd love to share with the audience.
So my favorite book is by Sun Tzu, The Art of War. I love the strategy. I think the strategy has stood the test of time. The strategy has worked in the most severe times, and it certainly is applicable even in non-war environments where decisions are important, and the strategy that guides those decisions need to be done with little error.
That's great. So how can our audience get in touch with you if they want to either hire you for consultant work, follow you in your work in general? What's the best way for them to do so?
Well, luckily, there's not too many Jerlando Jacksons, so a good Google search will probably bring you not only to my Professor Jackson page, which will share with you the work that I do as a part of the university. You can also go to Wisconsin Equity Inclusion Laboratory, the WE Lab, to see the work that we're doing there. But also, if you care to learn about some of the work that I do outside, you can go to jcfnet.com and see the work that we're doing with recidivism programs and other initiatives that are fighting to make the United States a better place. But I'm also available across all social media platform is Dr. JFL Jackson, and that's Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and even
what's that last one? Snapchat?
Instagram.
There
Sorry.
You go.
See, and so you might want to go to Instagram last, because that means I do the least activity on Instagram. But I'm on there. You might get a picture or two.
There you go. But the rest of them, you are active. So
I'm active on them almost every day, and I'm sharing content about our work. I'm sharing content about interesting information, and so sometimes I send out a did you know? And I'll send out a did you know message, and I'm curious if you are aware of the things that are going on across the world.
That's really good. And that's really good because it spurs conversation. And that's what we need to understand and have our eyes open a bit. So I really, I can't thank you enough for coming on, because I've wanted to do this topic since we started the podcast. But you got to have the right person. And then you were definitely the right person. You've spent your life's work in research and creating this and helping other companies and organizations and the University of Wisconsin-Madison become a better place. So thank you so much for helping us. And I know our listeners will get a lot out of this today. And for our listeners, I always remind you, follow us at Josh Kosnick on Instagram. We are active on Instagram to make sure that you can see snippets, previews of upcoming episodes, and you can click on the full link to hear Dr. Jackson today. I'll leave you with this. We created a diversity and inclusion mission statement, is to cultivate a culture that acknowledges and embraces the many ways to be human. And it took some time to create that, and we really stand by that, because we want to make sure that not only we're attracting people that can give me that diversity in thought, but also that I'm creating a culture that everyone wants to stay for the lifetime of their career, not just the traditional white male influence. So I really thank you again. Hopefully everybody took a bunch of notes today from Dr. Jackson, and make it a great week.